Good morning, everyone. So, for whatever reason, I've been thinking about the precepts a lot recently. And today I wanted to talk about the precept on alcohol or intoxicants. I think that there's a number of reasons why this might be interesting to talk about. I think one is the fact that in our particular tradition, we tend to sort of de-emphasize this precept maybe more than others, or reinterpret it to the point of oblivion of the original meaning. And I think another point is that America is sort of uniquely drugged. So reading from this, I got the idea for this from a podcast actually, where they were interviewing the author of a new book. This person's name is Benjamin Fong, and the book is called Quick Fixes: Drugs in America from Prohibition to the 21st Century Binge. And I'd just like to read the very first paragraph of this book to give you a sense of kind of what it's about. So he writes, American drug use today is truly world historical. At just 4% of the Earth's population, Americans consume 80% of its opioids, including 99% of its hydrocodone and 83% of its ADHD medications. 1 in 3 Americans is diagnosed with anxiety, depression, or both, while globally that number is about 1 in 20. 1 in 6 Americans is thus on a psychiatric medication. The $500 billion per year we spend on pharmaceuticals is complemented by another $150 billion per year on illegal drugs. By any measure, we are a uniquely drugged society. So I think that this is relevant, again, for a number of reasons. Right here in Bloomington, if you have your eyes open, you see this every day. We have a very large homeless population that's largely driven by drug abuse. Other countries that I've been to don't have problems, on this scale. Not to say that they're not there, but we're sort of uniquely problematic with it. Another reason, I'm sort of interested in talking about this is, for personal reasons. And in my own family, alcoholism has been a problem both in the past and in the present, on both sides of my family. So it's caused a lot of, pain and suffering, I think, for me personally, and in my, lineages past. And then finally, I think it's, sort of a reflection of our society more broadly, and it can be instructive for what we as Buddhist practitioners can do to, work within the society that we have that, is in many ways a driver of a lot of these issues through the suffering that it causes people and people's attempt to deal incorrectly with that sort of suffering. So with that in mind, I was reading through various sources on this. Bhikkhu Bodhi, the Theravada monk, has written a lot about precepts, and this isn't directly related to this, but he talks about similes that are used in a lot of these precept texts, and one is well known, and he writes that one simile compares the Buddha to a lotus flower, which is the paragon of beauty and purity. Just as a lotus grows up in a muddy lake, but rises above the water and stands in full splendor unspoiled by the mud, so the Buddha, having grown up in the world, overcomes the world and abides in its mist, untainted by its impurities. The Buddha's teaching of the true Dharma is like the sweet, perfumed fragrance emitted by the lotus flower, giving delight to all. And the Sangha is like the host of bees who collect around the lotus, gather up pollen, and fly off to their hive to transform it into honey. And I think that, this is relevant here, of course, because it's the difficulties of our society, the sort of samsaric qualities of American societies that leads people, I think, to drug and alcohol abuse. And this metaphor also fits here because we as Buddhists, I think, can kind of rise up out of that, samsaric situation, rather than, taking these destructive routes, take a more, healthy, wholesome approach. Bhikkhu Bodhi continues, he says, in our modern day pill-popping society, it may be hard to appreciate the real value of the guideline of abstaining from intoxicants. However, for those serious about the cultivation of mind through meditation exercises, one's ordinary confusion is quite enough to deal with, not to mention compounding it with powerful foreign substances. So, I just want to pause here, and I don't want to sound too moralizing. I've consumed alcohol throughout my life. Actually, this year, I stopped drinking, not because I had like a problem with it, but just because, again, like the family issues that I've dealt with, I felt like, it was a sort of form of solidarity with some people that are struggling with it, maybe. But I have found in this year, since I haven't been drinking, it's been kind of nice. So I can recommend it. So at any rate, just keep in mind, this is all my opinion. I think that the Soto Zen tradition is pretty accepting of alcohol consumption. But I'd just like to sort of share some, reasons why you might consider not doing that. So I'd like to sort of go through kind of the history of Buddhism's alcohol proscriptions, and kind of trace how we got from early Buddhism to where we are with Soto Zen today. And then also just sort of close with, some final thoughts on what this means for us here and now. So it says in, the Theravada version of the Vinaya, which is the collection of like 250 some odd rules that monks traditionally would have vowed to take on. So it says in that text, though the Buddha's discourses and advanced doctrines may be forgotten, so long as the Vinaya still stands, the Buddha's teachings yet endure, which I think is interesting, and obviously our tradition, we don't take the Vinaya precepts and we don't follow most of them. So this is just maybe to emphasize how we're a little bit out of the mainstream in our tradition, which, I think has positive and maybe some negative qualities. So the Vinaya, it technically only refers to alcohol. It doesn't refer to other drugs. But in practice, sort of the way you read the original Pali sentence in the case of the Theravada version, and also just sort of the general implication sort of suggests that any intoxicant that leads to heedlessness or carelessness is the term that's used, should be abstained from. And it's not actually just in the Vinaya that you have this prohibition on drinking alcohol. It has sort of a special status because in all, traditions other than Japanese Buddhism, lay people are expected to take 5 precepts, serious Buddhist practitioners who are lay people. And these are, not killing, not stealing, not doing sexual misconduct, not lying, and not consuming alcohol. And this doesn't mean, not getting drunk. It means like not drinking any alcohol. And so it's kind of, I think, interesting that it has this special status, like one of just 5 that is given to lay people, along with sort of the most fundamental types of moral prescriptions out there. So the original Pali sentence from the 5 precepts, says, "I undertake the training rule to abstain from fermented and distilled intoxicants, which are the basis for heedlessness." That's the way it's worded. And Bhikkhu Bodhi sort of writes that the word, it's maja, which refers to an intoxicant, can be related to the rest of the passage either as qualified by the previous terms, so like distilled liquors, which are intoxicants, or it can be read as an addition, so fermented and distilled liquors and other intoxicants. So it can, I guess, grammatically be interpreted either way. And in one case, it's explicit in prohibiting non-alcoholic intoxicants, and in the other case, it's merely strongly implied, because of the fact that it mentions heedlessness. And obviously we can say that other drugs are going to cause heedlessness as well, but usually the commentaries and stuff have excluded things like tobacco use. So in some Theravada countries, you'll see monks smoking cigarettes sometimes. I think it's probably discouraged, but it's not explicitly like prescribed by the Vinaya. And the texts also say that the motivating factor behind alcohol consumption is greed coupled with delusion. So, I think we're sort of, in some way, wanting this state that is different from our normal reality, or wanting to escape from something that we don't like. It's the classic aversion sort of situation where we're averse to reality as we experience it and want a different way to access it. And then coupled with delusion, so, not going about things the right way, not recognizing that, this reality as it is already enough. So in addition to this, its status in the 5 precepts, it's also one of the Vinaya precepts of, as I mentioned, this list of 250 some odd things, depending on the text. So there are different categories in the Vinaya, and they carry different penalties depending on the rule and the severity of it. So the most serious ones are called parajika offenses, and they result in you being expelled from the community. And then there are other ones where there has to be sort of a meeting to discuss what to do about your transgression. And there are others that you have to publicly confess. And then there are others that you merely have to sort of acknowledge to yourself that you did them and vow not to do them anymore. So alcohol consumption is under the confession category. So it doesn't result in expulsion from the community, but you are supposed to confess it at a full moon ceremony. So sort of like our Ryaku Fusatsu, historically, those would have been gatherings of monks or nuns to get together and confess these sort of slightly more minor transgressions. So there are 92 of these confession type rules, and some of them seem very arbitrary by our modern standards. So the one immediately after drinking alcohol is a prohibition on tickling. So if you tickle someone, you have to confess it. The one after that is a prohibition on playing in the water. Playing in the water. Yes, you can be in the water, but you can't play in the water. And there's another one shortly thereafter about intentionally scaring someone, so sort of hiding and like jumping out. There is one about not properly discoloring a robe. So one of the things that we do when we receive an okesa is we put a dot of ink in the corner, and that's one of these things. If you don't do that, you have to confess it. And all of these things also have stories associated with like why they exist. A lot of them are very funny. But also in this category, there are things that are more serious. It's not just tickling and scaring people. It includes lying, for example. So lying is in this category. Also the killing of animals, no matter how small, is in this category as well. But as I already mentioned, given alcohol's inclusion in the 5 precepts for lay people, we already know that it's more important than tickling. So the Theravada version of the Vinaya says, the drinking of alcohol or fermented liquor is to be confessed. And then it starts by giving the story as to why this rule was created. And I'll summarize the first part of it, but basically there was this teacher named Sagata, and he was supposed to have sort of a very powerful meditation practice, and it said that he subdued this naga, which is like sort of a mythological serpent dragon type figure that was kind of terrorizing a village just through the power of his meditation. So he's supposed to be this really kind of supreme practitioner. And then it continues that after he had done this great deed, then the Blessed One, having toured by stages, came to the village of Kosambi. The Kosambi lay followers, after welcoming the Blessed One, went to Venerable Sagata, and on arrival, having bowed down to him, sat to one side. As they were sitting, they said to him, "What, Venerable Sir, is something the masters like that is hard to get for you? What can we prepare for you?" So they want to know what kind of special treat he wants for being such a great guy. When this was said, some group of bhikkhus, a group of monks, said to the Kosambi lay followers, "Friends, there is a strong liquor called pigeon's liquor," and according to the commentaries, it's called this because it looked like the color of pigeon's feet, that the bhikkhus like and is hard for them to get. Prepare that. So, these monks just sort of chime in and it's like, "Hey, get them drunk." So then the Kosambi lay followers, having prepared pigeon's liquor in house after house, and seeing that Venerable Sagata had gone out for alms, said to him, "Master Sagata, drink some pigeon's liquor." "Master Sagata, drink some pigeon's liquor." Then Venerable Sagata, having drunk pigeon's liquor in house after house, passed out at the city gates as he was leaving the city. Then the Blessed One, leaving the city with a number of bhikkhus, saw that Venerable Sagata had passed out at the city gate. On seeing him, he addressed the bhikkhus, saying, "Bhikkhus, pick up Sagata." Responding, "As you say, Venerable Sir," the bhikkhus took Venerable Sagata to the monastery and laid him down with his head toward the Blessed One. So if you've ever spent any time at a monastery, in the Sodo, the practice room, you have to sleep with your head facing towards the Buddha. If you sleep with your feet towards the Buddha, it's considered disrespectful. So he lays him down with his head towards the Blessed One. Then Venerable Sagata turned around and went to sleep with his feet towards the Blessed One. So the Blessed One addressed the bhikkhus, saying, "In the past, wasn't Sagata respectful to the Tathagata and deferential?" "Yes, Venerable Sir." "But is he respectful to the Tathagata and deferential now?" "No, Venerable Sir." "And didn't Sagata do battle with the Ambatita Naga?" That's the serpent thing that he won over. "Yes, Venerable Sir." "But could he do battle with even a salamander now?" "No, Venerable Sir." So that's the end of the story. And obviously the implication being that, when we're drunk, we kind of, are less likely to act in socially acceptable ways, or skillfully, and, B, it can kind of embarrass the community in this case, like someone publicly passing out in the city gates. And this is sort of interesting, because in a sense you could read this as Sagata was maybe trying to just be respectful and receiving what was offered, because there was no prohibition on receiving alcohol. And from what I understand, this happens sometimes in Japan now. Like monks will get invited to lay people's houses to give them food and drink, and often they'll give them large amounts of alcohol, and it's sort of expected that they drink up, basically, to be polite to their hosts. Shoryu told me about this and said, he ended up getting really drunk at some lay follower's house, and that really calls to mind this kind of story, feeding him pigeon's liquor. So I think the idea probably was partially, so that lay followers wouldn't be tempted to give alcohol to monks, but also, because of this idea of carelessness and heedlessness, he can't do battle with even a salamander after being as drunk as he was. Okay, so Bhikkhu Bodhi also wrote recently about drinking, and he practiced in Sri Lanka, and he was describing being there, I think it was like in the late 90s, for some retreat. And in Theravada countries, lay people will come and make offerings to the community, to the Sangha. And in this case, he was there at the temple, and these people had come in from far away to give offerings, and he sort of noticed there was all this noise and commotion coming from one of the other rooms, and he asked someone, what's going on here? What's all this noise? And the person said, "Oh, they're drunk." And he said, the only thing that's kind of different about today is that they started in the morning and didn't even wait to get through all the ceremonies. And so he uses this as sort of a launching off point for this essay about kind of the problems of alcoholism, in Sri Lanka specifically, but also elsewhere. In this text, I just wanted to read from it a little bit. He says, for his lay followers, the Buddha has prescribed 5 precepts as the minimal moral observance: abstinence from killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, false speech, and the use of intoxicants. He did not lay down these precepts arbitrarily or out of compliance with ancient customs, but because he understood which lines of conduct led to our welfare and happiness and which led to harm and suffering. The 5th precept, it should be stressed, is not a pledge merely to abstain from intoxication or from excessive consumption of liquor. It calls for nothing short of total abstinence. By this rule, the Buddha shows that he has understood well the subtle, pernicious nature of addiction. Alcoholism rarely claims its victims in a sudden swoop. Usually it sets in gradually, beginning perhaps with the social icebreaker, the drink among friends, or the cocktail after a hard day's work. But it often does not stop there. Slowly it sinks its talons into its victims' hearts until they are reduced to its helpless prey. And I think that this, is an interesting point, because I think in many cases, you can drink your whole life and not have any problem. It might not cause you any problems in your life. But it's also possible for it to go for something that you have very much in control, to something bad happening in your life, something stressful happening, and then it going in the other direction. And the same can be said of drugs. So Bhikkhu Bodhi continues here. To dispel any doubt about his reasons for prescribing this precept, the Buddha has written the explanation into the rule itself. One is to refrain from the use of intoxicating drinks and drugs because they are the cause of heedlessness. Heedlessness means moral recklessness, disregard for the bounds between right and wrong. It is loss of heedfulness, moral scrupulousness based on a keen perception of the dangers in unwholesome states. So, I think about some of the things that I've done in my life, while drinking. One thing that came to mind, when I lived in Germany, there you're allowed to drink in public. And I remember one time I was biking. So I was in the city in northern Germany where everyone bikes everywhere. So I was biking back to my apartment with some friends, and I had a bottle of wine as I was biking. And it was empty, and I was kind of drunk, and I just threw the bottle up into the air because I just wanted to hear it break, I guess. And my girlfriend at the time was like, "Are you crazy?" And I was just like, and this is the sort of thing that obviously I would not have done sober. Obviously it's not the most destructive thing in the world, but also not something that I would brag about exactly. So, and obviously, depending on how alcohol or drugs affect you, or what the drug that you're taking is, the results of your behavior can be a lot worse than that. So that's kind of a rough overview of how early Buddhism and the Theravada tradition sees alcohol consumption. So it's pretty much a teetotaling tradition. When we get to the Mahayana, things start to change a little bit. And I guess we can start with the fact that the precepts that we take don't actually say that you can't drink alcohol. They say that you can't sell alcohol, which is a little strange. And this comes from a text called the Brahma Net Sutra, which is important in our tradition. This is kind of ultimately the source of our precepts. And the 10 major precepts in this text are essentially the same as the ones that we take. So just like ours, the 5th precept is the prohibition of the sale of alcohol. And the text for it says, "My disciples, if you yourself sell alcohol, or you encourage others to do so, then herein are the causes of selling alcohol, the conditions for selling alcohol, the method of selling alcohol, and the act of selling alcohol." So these 4 things, all the Vinaya precepts have these things, like this is the cause of it, the conditions for doing it, the means by which you do it, and what it means to actually carry out, and the result and all that. So it's sort of checking the boxes to make it look like a traditional Vinaya text. All kinds of alcohol should not be sold, as it leads to the commission of crimes. Instead, bodhisattvas should give rise to penetrating wisdom in all sentient beings. If, on the other hand, they lead sentient beings into disordered states of mind, this is a bodhisattva parajika offense. So in the Vinaya, there's no parajika offense, so that's like the most serious kind that would get you expelled from the community around alcohol, but there is here. And this text, the Brahma Net Sutra, is, it's not an Indian text. It was composed in China, it's generally thought, which, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really matter where the text came from. But at any rate, this is kind of an innovation later on rather than something that goes back to the early tradition. However, so even though that's the only precept around alcohol that we take as Soto Zen practitioners, in the Brahma Net Sutra, there's also a big list of minor precepts. And there is a minor precept on not drinking alcohol in addition. So they categorize selling as like a more serious offense than consumption, but it's still prescribed. So in that section it says, "My disciples, if you intentionally drink alcohol, there is no limit to the mistakes and violations you will make. If with your own hand you pass the wine bottle to another, you will be born without hands for 500 lifetimes. How much worse if you drink the wine yourself?" So this is common for them to lay out some kind of karmic punishment you'll receive. "You should not encourage any person to drink, nor any sentient being to do so. How much worse if you yourself drink alcohol? If you intentionally drink or encourage someone else to do so, you have committed a minor transgression of the precepts." So in China and Korea, the Vinaya was continually at least, received, not always necessarily followed to the T. And I read a little bit from a text called, it's by William Bodiford, who's an important scholar of Soto Zen. And the text it's called "Going Forth, Visions of Buddhist Vinaya." And it's a collection of essays by different authors, and he has one himself on the Vinaya in Japan. But in his introduction, he talks about kind of the evolution of the Vinaya as it goes from India to China to Japan. And one of the things that he talks about is in China, and this applies to a lot of the textual tradition in China. So there had already been a lot of texts written in the Buddhist tradition prior to Buddhism's arrival in China, and these came from a variety of communities that were often at odds with one another, and the Vinaya was no exception. So there are something like 5 different versions of the Vinaya that were translated into Chinese, and they have kind of minor differences and sometimes contradictions. And then in addition, you get a text like this Brahma Net Sutra, which claims to be a Mahayana thing, and people are saying the other things are, outdated Hinayana practice. So this is developing stream that these precepts laid out in the Brahma's Net Sutra is kind of the true Mahayana way to go, and all that other stuff is just kind of old-fashioned. So despite sort of arguments to that effect, like I said, in Korea and China and Chinese Buddhist countries to this day, people still take the Vinaya precepts. But in Japan, this argument won out. So there's a really important Japanese Buddhist named Saicho, who was the founder of Tendai Buddhism. So this was, I think, in the 8th century. And so he introduced Tendai Buddhism to Japan. And at the time, both in China and Japan, the government kind of controlled ordination. So they had these ordination platforms, and to be ordained, you had to do it at one of these official government-sponsored ordination platforms, or you couldn't get ordained. Or if you tried to do it some other way, you were considered kind of illegitimate. So Saicho, coming from this different tradition, and these other schools of Buddhism really having the government's ear a little bit more than he did, for kind of somewhat political purposes, it seems, he was able to remove the monopoly on these ordination platforms by basically arguing that the Vinaya was a Hinayana, that is sort of a lesser practice, whereas the Brahma Net Sutra Mahayana precepts were sort of the true way to go. So it was a little bit cynical, although he did have kind of a doctrinal basis for it. And after that, basically all other Japanese Buddhist sects followed, or they grew out of Tendai, like Soto Zen. and so followed in that way. The only ones that still do the Vinaya precepts are like a very small group of very old Buddhist schools in Japan that have not very many adherents. Okay, so it's from this context of Saicho, the Tendai practitioner, that we get the Soto Zen situation. So as you'll recall, Dogen started his practice in this tradition in Tendai, and a lot of his views, are strongly informed by Tendai. So even though he went to China and was taking this Zen tradition to Japan, in many ways it's sort of a fusion with his existing understanding of Buddhism through Tendai. And it was in Tendai that kind of the understanding of the precepts as more kind of a like metaphorical almost, or as something that have more of a ritual significance rather than a literal significance, got started. And Dogen's Soto Zen tradition sort of continues with that in large part. So in my opinion, as I sort of alluded to in the beginning, Soto Zen has kind of reinterpreted the alcohol precept to the point that it has lost its original meaning, right? It has nothing to do with alcohol anymore. It's just about wisdom and ignorance, as we'll see. So this has a history. It didn't come out of nowhere. So in this book, Going Forth, Visions of Buddhist Vinaya, William Bodiford writes, so this is starting in the Tendai tradition, but picked up by Soto Zen. The purpose of the ordination is not to instill morality, but to confirm the inherent awakening naturally possessed by all beings. Thus, behavior, either in conformity with or in violation of the precepts, is relatively meaningless. So precepts in Japan came to have kind of more to do with establishing an esoteric connection with Shakyamuni Buddha than they did with the actual like moral content of the precepts themselves. So it got wrapped up in this kind of obsession with lineage. So, as part of the precept ceremony, a lot is made of the unbroken lineage between us, and of course we receive Kechimyaku, this document that certifies that. So Bodiford continues here that normally ordination is sort of seen as the seed of our practice, like it's when we're sort of planting the first seed. And after becoming a novice and practicing, we mature into the fruit of Buddhahood. But for the Tendai school, the ordination was said to work in a process in the exact reverse of this. So they said that from the fruit to the seed. So the Buddha awakening embodied in precepts finds human expressions through the ordination process. The ritual establishes a connection between the abstract Buddha and patriarchs and the concrete human predicament, allowing faith to replace insight. So essentially this kind of faith in the lineage, this notion that by establishing this connection with the Buddha, we can kind of overcome the need to, this is similar to Dogen's question, right? Like, why do we need to practice? So this is all kind of stuff justifying that we don't need to practice. We just need to establish this kind of magical connection. So he continues, as in the practices of Tantric Buddhism, in which proper ritual actions permit the practitioner to embody fully the characteristics of the Buddha, proper ritual ordination with the precepts allows the ordinary person to assume the mind of awakening regardless of behavior. So, obviously Dogen wouldn't agree with this quite 100%. I think that because this was sort of an existing thing in Japan, he takes it up, but he himself, reinterprets it. And I think it goes back to what we talked about last time. So in doing no evil, that text, Dogen makes it clear that we have to go beyond good and evil in our practice through our zazen. And that would seem to suggest like some of this stuff, like we don't actually need to practice the precepts, but he also makes it very clear that to go beyond good and evil, we need to do good. So that's the part that's like missing from some of this stuff. And there's a tendency to want to interpret it that way because you're like, oh, well, I've already established a connection with the Buddha, so like I'm done. It's sort of like, you know, a lot of the times here at Sanshinji, when people receive the precepts, lay precepts, they disappear. It's like they've graduated or something. So obviously we're not like giving, you know, we're not telling people that like, oh, you just need to like take precepts and then you've graduated and you're done. But still, people get that in their heads, and I think that there's this sort of unspoken, you know, I can sort of understand how people get that idea, I guess I should say, even though it's not what Dogen would say and it's not what we would say. Okay, so just to give you an idea of how this alcohol precept is interpreted, Hojo-san gave a talk at Zen Mountain Monastery years back, and he talks a little bit about the kind of typical interpretation of the precept. And you know, I should note, no offense to Hojo-san, but it doesn't talk much at all about actually consuming alcohol. So this is kind of, you know, the standard thing in Japanese Buddhism, so it's nothing to do with him. So first, Bodhidharma's one mind precepts are one way that these more kind of esoteric understandings of the precepts get expressed. So in this text, which actually comes out of the Tendai tradition, although it was picked up by the Zen tradition later, it says, self-nature is inconceivably wondrous. In the intrinsically pure Dharma, not arousing ignorance is called not being intoxicated. So we've gone from not drinking to not arousing ignorance. So you can see, obviously, the relationship. Drinking alcohol is one specific way that we give rise to ignorance. And as the Theravada texts said, you know, that's one of the causes is ignorance coupled with greed when we drink. But here, the actual like drinking part is kind of being thrown away. It's saying just don't give rise to ignorance. Like, and the implication is, well, you could still drink alcohol probably and somehow not give rise to ignorance. So the text that we most often hear here at Sanshinji related to the precepts is the Kyoju Kaimon, which is the text that we read at Ryaku Fusatsu, which is our kind of version of this repentance ceremony that I mentioned before. And we read Dogen's commentary on the precepts, so basically on, you know, the 10 major precepts from the Brahmanet Sutra. And there's this, the commentary on the not selling liquor part is quite curious. So it says, do not bring intoxicants in, do not let them come in. This is truly the great brightness, and in parentheses of wisdom. If you look at the actual like Chinese or Japanese text, though, it's even more enigmatic than this. So in Hojo-san's translation, it says, do not bring intoxicants in, but the word intoxicant or alcohol doesn't actually appear. There's no stated subject or object. So the most literal translation that you could make of the Chinese version of this text is, not bring in, do not let encroach. Truly is great brightness. That would be like character for character. So we have to kind of fill in the gaps here. And it's interesting with this text because it was transmitted both in a Chinese version and a Japanese version. So the Japanese version adds a little bit more because it actually takes this compound of not bring in and treats that as the object of what we should not let encroach, which is kind of weird. But Hojo-san explains this in his essay. So in this sense, it's do not allow not bringing in to intrude. So what does that mean? It's sort of, you know, when you start to think about it, kind of a typical Dogen type thing. So let's see here. Did I lose my last page here? Okay, hold on just a sec. Okay, so this alludes, according to we go. So Kishizawa Ian Roshi, who is an important scholar of Soto Zen Buddhism in the kind of late or the early 20th century, he introduces a koan story in which this phrase "bring in" appears. So these same characters that are where we have "not bring in Dogen's commentary, it's "bring in" here. And some of you might know this one, but it's Tozan. So Tozan is the founder of the Soto school in China. So the To is where we get the To and Soto from. So this koan goes like this. The master Tozan instructed, even if you straightforwardly say that originally there is no one single thing, still you will not be able to distinguish the fifth ancestor's bag of the begging bowl. So this alludes to this famous story about the poetry competition between the fifth ancestor and Shen Shu. So in this story, many of you probably know this already, but the Shen Shu writes his verse, the body is the Bodhi tree, the mind is like a bright mirror stand. At all times we should polish it and must not let the dust collect. And then in response to this, Huineng, who's our ancestor, writes, Bodhi originally has no tree, the bright mirror has not a stand either. From the beginning, there is no one single thing. Where is the room for dust? So this no one single thing is the thing referred to in this koan. So even if you straightforwardly say that originally there is no one single thing, still you will not be able to extinguish the fifth ancestor's bag of the begging bowl. So that means like the fact that he received the lineage from his teacher. So a monk asked, Shen Shu said that we should diligently practice and polish the bright mirror not to let the dust collect. Why did not he receive the robe and bowl? I wonder who could get them. The master Tozan said, the one who does not enter through the gate. The monk asked, does such a person who does not enter through the gate get it or not? The master said, even though it is thus, Huineng could not avoid giving it to such a person. Or sorry, not Huineng, Huineng's teacher. The master Tozan gave an instruction. Even if you straightforwardly say that originally there is no one single thing, still you will not be able to extinguish the fifth ancestor's bag of the begging bowl. So he repeats the same phrase as before. Here you should give one pivotal phrase. Tell me, what do you have to say? So he wants him to resolve this koan, basically. He's like, figure it out. And so the monk tried to say a phrase 96 times, but his sayings did not accord with the master's intention. The last time, finally, he said something to satisfy Master Tozan. And Tozan said, why didn't you say so sooner? And then I'll kind of skip a little bit, but basically there's this monk who didn't hear what he said and he wants to get him to tell and he won't tell. And finally, the monk threatens to kill him. And he's like, all right, I'll tell you. So he says, his response was, even if it is taken in, I don't have a room to place it. So this taken in is this bring in, don't bring it in. The monk made a prostration with gratitude. So the idea being here that this phrase, originally there is no one single thing. The response is, even if I bring in that phrase, like bring it into my mind, I don't have a room to place it, is what he says. So the idea here is it's already something extra. So the original phrase gestures at the same thing, right? This idea of dust is already something extra. But then if we attach to this idea of no dust, then that itself is in turn something extra. So Hojo-san's interpretation, and that he gets, I think, from Kishizawa Roshi, is that this not bringing in is again another thing that we can get attached to. So when he says, don't let not bringing in encroach, it's this idea of getting attached to this, third iteration of the message here. So you don't get attached to this not bringing in either. And Hojo-san here says that this is basically what our Zazen is like, right? It's this kind of constant process of negation. We have thoughts constantly arising and we're constantly letting them go. We're not getting attached to them. And He says, this letting go of thought is continuous negation of the polishing the mirror, bringing in the not one single thing, and even not bringing in the no one single thing. So we have to be always negating. He also mentions another text where this occurs, which is another famous one that I know Seigen likes, which is, and it goes like this. This is shorter, so he says, when not a single thing is brought, then what? Zhao Zhou said, put it down. Yan Yang said, if I don't bring a single thing, what should I put down? And Zhao Zhou said, then carry it out. So the word here that's used for a single thing being brought in, again, it's the same, brought in. So in this interpretation, I think it seems like a good one. This phrase is referring, to these koan stories. So just reading it simply as, do not bring intoxicants in, maybe misses some of this deeper meaning of what Dogen intended. However, again, as I was kind of saying, this doesn't really tell us much about what to do with actual alcohol. And it would be interesting to know what Dogen would have said. I don't think we really have a clear record of what his literal interpretation of consuming alcohol would be. I think my guess would be that given he seemed to have a pretty strong sort of desire to practice in an authentic way and to follow monastic principles strongly, that he would have probably expected this of his monks, but I'm not totally sure of that either. But at the same time, we can kind of use this precept to go beyond the precept as well. But that, as Dogen says in Doing No Evil, that's not an excuse normally to abandon that thing. It's just something that we do as Buddhists, but then we also sort of go beyond in a conceptual way. So basically, I don't know what the answer is. I can't say that we shouldn't drink alcohol definitively, or that we should. I mean, maybe if you can avoid it for sure, but whether or not we need to be teetotalers in our tradition, I don't know. One thing that I can say is, doing some of this research in Japan, there has been this constant worry over time that the abandoning of the precepts has been sort of a mistake, and that you see all these attempts to kind of reestablish it over time. But in Japan, the general trend has been sort of for priests to be more like lay people, which has its advantages, I think. So we shouldn't discount that. It allows us to live in the world in a way that kind of cloistered Theravada monks maybe can't quite as much. And that has value for sure. But I think that there's also a strong case, for at least taking a hard look at what we're doing, when we take intoxicants. Are we just trying to escape something that we could fix in another more skillful way? Is there something about our lives that we're doing that's, just kind of punishing enough and causes enough suffering that we feel the need to do this, that we could change somehow? Or we just sort of, I talked last time about going with the flow versus going against the stream. Are we just going with the flow of society to the point that it's leading us to do these kinds of things? Or can we go against the stream and do something different in our lives that makes us not suffer to the point of feeling the need to, take intoxicants or drink alcohol? So I think that, if we combine what Dogen has to say about not giving rise to ignorance, we just need to look at this with clear eyes, see what this is really about. What are we really doing? Just like we do when we do Zazen, we can kind of see clearly moment by moment. So we have to, again, let Zazen be the true teacher. Let this, truth of the absolute and emptiness inform what we do in our lives. So I think with that, I'll end there. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Funny story, kind of funny. So the Quantum School does the 5 precepts for their practitioners. And there was an occasion, I used to sit a lot with the Minneapolis Citizen Center, was in that school. And so there was an occasion where a person said to the Roshi, well, you know, I really like your teachings, but I have a problem. I'm an alcoholic. And the teacher responds, oh, no problem for you 4.
Yeah, I want to say this has come up before because I remember hearing in grad school that they would give certificates to lay people for each of the precepts that they took. So it wasn't necessarily that you had to take 5. So they said, like, oh well, you're a sleazy businessman. You can't do the precept on not lying, but you can not drink and not kill. So you get the certificate for those 2, and just maybe try again next time and do better. So certainly I think that is a good point. There's always merit in doing. We're not going to be perfect. Obviously, we're deeply flawed humans. So any kind of area where we can, do a little bit of improvement to help a little bit in society, I think, is valuable, even if we're, not not the best in other areas. So I think that's a good point.
Thank you for your teaching, and congratulations on renunciating your alcohol.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so that was really interesting. To just hear you kind of trace through basically Buddhist history the way that this precept is, flowing and changing and interpretations, and so it had the effect for me of kind of grounding that precept, and I think by extension all the precepts in a different way, making them feel very concrete in that people have been engaging with these for 2,000 years or whatever, and many ideas have flown. And I was thinking about this precept a good deal when I was just at a bachelor party a couple of weekends ago with some old friends from college who I broke this precept with very often in college in ways that I knew then and very much know now were, causing harm in different ways, and were sort of ways of kind of, as you say, sort of like compensating for suffering in some, even just social anxieties. People use alcohol as a way of kind of lubricating the social, difficulties that they may have. And so during this bachelor party, many of the people there were just sort of like, this is the time where you just get drunk without any, it's almost a built-in, that's sort of assumed. And for me, I found myself sort of just not knowing exactly how to approach it. And what I ended up doing is what I usually tend to do, and whenever I do drink alcohol, just have a few. And in a way, that feels like a little cop-out. It's like, oh, you're following the middle way. You're being moderate, but I think, in a sense, being able to be in a situation where many of the people around you are sort of going all out, and you're just sort of maybe modeling how to be with this substance without it sort of taking you over completely.
Right.
So that's one way that I was kind of thinking about it. It's like, well, I can, it doesn't appear to be deluding me, which it probably was still, but in that situation, maybe that's something because I also felt like, well, if I just say I'm not going to drink anything while you fools just go party wild, and there's a sort of way that you can separate yourself. And so anyway, it was a very interesting line to be walking on, especially after just having formally received the precepts again, and so it was very fresh. Anyway, that's just sort of a relevant story for this, I guess.
Yeah. Well, as long as you didn't sell them any alcohol, you're technically in the clear.
Right. But yeah, I think that you make good points there. I think that
this idea of modeling behavior is sort of what I had in mind, with this family member of mine. I think, things as subtle as that are unlikely to probably have any appreciable effect, but at least it's some gesture, and my thought is, thinking of this person, in my life. I feel like even if I drank a small amount, they would see that as sort of a, authorization for them to do what they're doing, kind of, because there's this. I mean, in the case of alcoholism, of course, there's this huge component of denial, that people think that they're moderate drinkers even though they're alcoholics. So I think in that case, even drinking a small amount could send the wrong message, because the person can be, oh, they're just like me, just drinking a small amount of alcohol just like I do. The context that you describe is probably kind of different. People drinking at a bachelor party does not necessarily indicate like serious problems with alcoholism, although it could be the case. So I don't, again, I don't have the answers. I think that we have to do our best with skillful means, like how do we behave skillfully as practitioners in that context. I mean, I will say that during this year of not drinking, I have on several occasions been to bars with people where people are just like, hey, like, let's go out, and I'm like, well, okay, like, I'm not going to say no, because then I'm just not going to see you. And nowadays there usually are a lot of like non-alcoholic options, including non-alcoholic beers and stuff, so you can kind of still participate while not drinking. It was actually kind of funny, I met 3 people from grad school, and one of the other grad students had also stopped drinking since I last saw him. I didn't inquire as to why, but also someone who studies Japanese Buddhism, interestingly. So at any rate, there are still ways I think that we can, even if you choose not to drink, you can still interact with people who do drink in those contexts. So I don't know if that answers anything, but it's the best I got. Anything else this morning?
I'd be interested in your take on this. So I quit drinking more than 30 years ago, at least to the point that of getting drunk. A couple of times I did drink, like I went to mass, and so that was the blood of Jesus, so I guess that doesn't count.
Yeah,
right?
it's transubstantiated.
But there's also a Tibetan Vajrayana ceremony called a soak, where you're feeding the deities. And it's almost the opposite of what we have here, because you got all these Daeglo deities, and you got these drunk and all that. I mean, it seems almost like a complete opposite of what we do here. But when you're feeding the deities apparently like to drink because they have whiskey. Since I don't drink, we just took a little bit and I was looped.
Yeah.
And yet, this is a ceremony being done by monks that take the long list of precepts, including don't drink, but they're obviously drinking here.
Right.
So what do you think about this religious exception for Vajrayana ceremonies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's
it points to what happened, I think, in Japanese Buddhism. So, according to scholars, this, so it's going back to Saicho, the person who basically got Japanese Buddhists off the hook of taking the Vinaya precepts. In addition to bringing back Tendai, he was also, I think through that school in China, exposed to esoteric Buddhism. And so even though the more famous esoteric Buddhist from that time is Kukai, who brought over the Shingon school, the Tendai school also had esoteric elements, and scholars refer to it as a esoteric, exoteric tradition because it kind of combines elements of both. And that continues through the sort of daughter schools of Tendai, including Soto Zen. So I think that, like I was saying, with these ordination precept ceremonies taking on kind of a more esoteric tone in Japanese Buddhism, the things I think that have gone on that have allowed for alcohol consumption in Tibetan Buddhism are similar. And they involve these sort of, reinterpretations essentially of texts that have an obvious literal meaning, but then can be interpreted very differently. So basically, I don't know, like what I personally think about it. I mean, I don't know. I don't know enough about Tibetan Buddhism to like give a good response. I mean, I know that Chongyam Trungpa, the famous 20th century Tibetan. Yeah. I think that I've read some of his stuff, and I think it's, from what I've read, mostly really good. Like, he seems to have had a good understanding of things, and yet, he was this alcoholic who basically died of alcoholism. And of course, the same thing is true of many important Soto Zen. Yeah, exactly. And I noticed, related to that, in Maezumi Roshi's lineage, the fifth precept is actually written as "do not give rise to ignorance." It's completely changed. I mean, you can argue that that's a translation because that's the way that Japanese Buddhists interpret it. But it's kind of troubling, I guess, to me a little bit that, in a lineage where its founder, died of alcoholism, probably, that, that would be the case. So I don't know. I mean, I think there are dangers in going in that direction, but I think that you can argue that there are reasons as well that are legitimate. So I don't know if that's.
Well, there's also the paradigm in the symposium. Basically, a drinking party in which everyone's getting drunk. But Plato kind of rationalizes that, I think, by suggesting that it's a test of your character. I mean, can you get drunk and maintain your integrity?
right.
And if you can do that, then you're like Socrates. If you can't, you got some work to do.
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah, that's interesting. Of course, I think, so much depends on your genetics in that case, like, because there are some people who drink and it doesn't like make them do crazy things. And then there are other people who, drink and they're just like totally off the wall immediately, and I don't know if it has anything to do with their character, but maybe it does. I don't know. Who knows? Anyways, yeah. So I don't have very satisfying answers, but needless to say, it's not restricted to Japanese Buddhism. Anything else this morning?
Hi.
Oh, should we take the one online first? Sorry. Okay.
Online. Hi. First, I would like to say I had a good friend that became an alcohol addict, and I saw him once hitting his old mother, and all the time wanted to take her money. So drinking might be, in minor cases, just for fun, but it might be like a Holocaust. It's something terrible.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to get out of it, almost impossible. And the law doesn't prohibit him to drink, so he can drink as much as he wants. Nobody can put him in jail because of it. And the other thing is, I think the precept of drinking, it's not just drinking, it's just we all have pain, and then we get addicted to things which it's very difficult to get out of. You can become bulimic. You can cut yourself. Some people cut themselves. It's like taking drugs or drinking alcohol. It's exactly the same. You can take drugs. There are many things to get addicted to avoid your mental pain. You get addicted. So by saying don't drink, it means that in Buddhism we try to meditate, we try to speak with the Sangha and not getting addicted to anything that which is substances or physical pain, causing ourselves physical pain, because when we get pain to ourselves, we also get pain to the society, to other people, and it's very dangerous.
Yeah.
So I don't understand. It's not just alcohol. Maybe when the precepts were written, it was more alcohol, but today it might be something else. So it's everything that easy way to take pain away instead of meditating.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's absolutely right. And I think that's why there's a tendency in the tradition, early on to
interpret this precept as not being just restricted to alcohol, but to any kind of intoxicant. And then, as we see in the Mahayana tradition, sort of any giving rise to ignorance, at least when it's kind of charitably interpreted. And
thank you for sharing that. I think, so many people have these stories about how addiction, one way or another, has negatively affected people they know and love. And I think that's sort of where this prohibition maybe comes from is again, we might get through life without having any problem, but it's kind of like why I roll the dice, if there's, like if you're getting on a plane and there's a 5% chance that it's going to crash, you're probably not going to get on it, right? So I think you can make a similar argument here potentially. And I thank you for bringing this back up, but just to emphasize, I think it's, society's problems, this samsaric world that leads us to all of these forms of addiction, whether it be drugs or alcohol or something else. And so again, I think that our job as bodhisattvas is to do what little we can in the world to make this world more of a pure land and less of one of samsara. So obviously we can't do it single-handedly, but we can make small differences. So thank you. Jeff, sorry, did you have something?
Talk a lot, and I enjoyed following the storyline, the arc that you drew. But at the end, I flashed back to the beginning with the quote that you read from the book, of the enormity of the societal characteristics that have evolved, and it included, the use of psychiatric drugs in a really young population, which precedes a lot of the individual stories and responses to the world and the way I think you meant it. So so my observation is that there's this, for me at least, this need to try to resolve the best practices for an individual, myself, or the individuals around me, and how to understand beneficial action on a societal level. So the difference between individual health and public health, and the rules and the ethics that govern those things. And that's
I think
I try to draw it into a question, but it was just an observation to share.
Yeah.
I was thinking about something similar, just maybe phrased differently, which is that, except for maybe alcohol, I think most intoxicants are also medicinal somehow.
Right.
And I think what you might be saying, Jeff, is like kind of balancing the skillful means, I suppose, between the cost of intoxication and the medicinality of being anesthetized or analgesia, maybe even more better, pain relief, and whatever it might be, right? Adderall, for example, is a very fun substance, but some people need it to be able to like sit down and do their work or whatever it might be, right? But it's also probably true that they're maybe not quite so clear as I otherwise be.
Yeah, I think that there are multiple problems, of course, going on. I think one is, like, as I've kind of emphasized, is that the nature of our society being driven by, the profit motive and everything is can be quite crushing to a lot of people, to the point that they, need either legal or illegal drugs to just get through the day. And then I think on top of that, also related to the profit motive, is the pharmaceutical industries pushing these drugs onto people, and doctors profiting off of it, essentially. So the more they prescribe, the more kickback they get, and that sort of thing. So I think it's a compounding of the first problem, and I mean, I think it ultimately the root is sort of the unhappiness and suffering in our society. But again, that's compounded by the way that our society doles out drugs. And obviously, I think compared to some countries, things probably aren't as bad here as they might be in some places. Yet in those places, maybe they just don't have access to drugs, either illegal or legal. And which isn't to say that they wouldn't take them if they had them available. And then in other places, I think you can say that their societal issues are less pronounced, which might drive lower consumption of drugs, both legal and illegal. So I think that anything that we can do, obviously it would take sort of someone with a special skill set to make a difference in sort of public health circles. But if we are able to do something, we should do something, is all that I can kind of say. And then regarding your point about like the medicinal aspect, one of the points that this book makes, which is kind of funny, is how medicinal drugs like opiates have become, like, formerly they were primarily used in medicinal ways, and they still are, but they've become the most pernicious drugs. And then drugs that were formerly just recreational, like ketamine, have become things that are used in therapy. And things that were commonly accepted and not considered that bad, like tobacco use, are now widely reviled. So, he's kind of arguing that in this sort of ramping up of our drug use, also everything is kind of topsy-turvy in terms of, how things are used medicinally or recreationally, which I thought was interesting.
The Jungian roots of the 12-step program. I can't remember his name, the guy who started 12-step, but he was actually associated with Carl Jung. And he took from Jung the idea that alcohol we call spirit, but we're living in an age of nihilism. So we're suffering from a kind of a spiritual deficit.
Right.
And so we try to fill in that, in a material society, we try to fill that in with a material spirit.
Right.
And that's Jung's notion of the nature of addiction in the modern world, is we're lacking that spiritual guidance that we need.
Yes, yeah.
But I have to plug a book too on this subject. So there's a 12, we in 12-step they say, one day at a time. Well, there's a book, I can't remember his name, but he's a Theravada practitioner, and he wrote a book called One Breath at a Time. And he takes the 12-step program and he gives it a Buddhist interpretation. So if you've got a drinking problem and you want to do 12-step and you want a Buddhist paradigm, then I would recommend One Breath at a Time.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to check that out. Yeah, this member of mine, is always asking me about my Buddhist practice, but not necessarily taking many lessons from it. So that might be a good point of entry. So I'll check it out. No, not in town, but. So anything else this morning before we wrap up? Anyone online? All right. Well, thank you, everyone.